Hi everyone, welcome to another A&E Insights video. Today in the month of October, we are talking about self-advocacy here at A&E, specifically because we have on October 17th our symposium on the topic of self-advocacy. We'd love to see you there. And today I'm really excited to have with me Kelley Challen, who is a transition specialist. Thanks so much for being here, Kelley.
Thank you so much for having me, Maggie.
I would love for you to tell our audience a little bit about yourself, and what, self-advocacy means for you.
Oh boy. So, as we've said a couple of times, I'm Kelley Challen. I'm the founder of Challen Education and Transition Services. So I'm a transition specialist, which nobody really knows what that is the first time they hear it, unless you're really heavily involved in special education. So I'm a transition specialist, but I'm a private transition specialist who works with students and families and schools. And I conduct individualized transition assessments and help to really develop plans and a planning process for students, really to prepare them for life after special education or life after high school in a 504 plan, or just prepare for the future. I also work with young adults and really think about what their future goals are and what kinds of resources and supports and other things can best get them to those goals. So everything that I do as a professional, whether it's coaching or consulting or planning or assessing, it's all around thinking about what does an individual want in their future as far as learning experiences, as far as work experiences, and as far as increased independent living or community engagement, things like that. So I'm always looking at those three buckets with individuals that I work with and trying to set goals and plan for that. And as you can imagine, like self-advocacy is a huge part of that process. Um, Really, like everything that I do, but also everything that I know is useful to do with young people, for young people, like just with like anyone, is all about helping people to figure out more about who they are, like what they're interested in, what they're good at. We all need to know what kinds of things are hard for us, right? We all need to know what kinds of things are helpful for us. So, like understanding more about who you are and then being able to explain that to another person, get a support that you need, be able to, I mean, like really just be more empowered in your life. It all comes from being self-aware and being a good self-advocate, right? So I think what's interesting about transition planning is self-advocacy is an important part of the planning process. So it's sort of the foundation of good transition planning is having students be able to be self-advocates. And at the same time, self-advocacy is also like a product of good transition planning, right? Like an individual being able to better know themselves, better advocate for themselves, better get what they want in life. Like that's all something that we're striving for as part of this process too. So, I mean, self-advocacy is like, it's the center and it's the goal. That
That's
makes sense.
such an interesting and wonderful point. You're both building the skill, but then also needing to hear from the students what they want, what their goals are. And so it's a wonderful cycle, it seems like, and hopefully one that's really preparing kids and I mean young adults and teens for a future where they can advocate for themselves. I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about how you include the student's voice in as you plan for their goals.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's really any way possible, right? So I think the most important thing is not to make any goals or plans without knowing who the student is and what they're interested in. And there are lots of different ways to engage a student or engage a student's voice in a process, right? I mean, certainly for myself, I want to meet an individual. I want to be able to talk to that individual. I want to be able to use any tools that I have to help that individual figure out how to express what they're interested in and what they want. I also think sometimes that can be hard for people. So getting a sense of other people who know a student or a young adult well and what that individual has expressed to other people is just as important, right? There are some really interesting and useful transition planning processes that are person-centered planning processes where you really pull together a whole community of people who know an individual well and try to get a sense of like everything about that person, what they love, what they don't love, like what their interests are and how you might plan for the future. But it all has to really be about the individual. I think I mentioned that I'm involved in special education processes sometimes. And I think sometimes when we're following processes, especially like legal or regulated processes, they can become about the process or become about paperwork or become about the adults in the room. And so just constantly reminding myself and reminding anybody who's involved that like all of this is about a person, and all of this is about a person that we want to be able to achieve their goals someday, want to be more independent than they are in the future, right? If somebody's in school, we always want them to be more independent than they are right
Yeah,
now. And so all of that comes from like bringing the student's voice into the process, inviting the student to be an active part of the process, giving the student the skills that they need to be an active part of this process. I'm a big believer that we need to be teaching a 3-year-old, right, how to make choices, how to order for themselves at a restaurant, how to engage help from a customer service, in a store, like really teaching those self-advocacy skills from young ages so that students then have the advocacy skills to be part of bigger processes that are part of their lives.
that's such a great point about working with younger populations in building those. What do I want? What do I need? How do I ask for it? That's so important. I love that. And you talked a little bit about, getting to know all the different people who know an individual. I'm wondering about those times where maybe you find that it is maybe more process or paperwork oriented, or times where maybe a parent's goals might differ from what an individual wants for themselves. I don't know, I think about families we talk to here at A&E, and sometimes parents might not feel good about the goals their child has set for themselves, or we also hear sometimes about teens who really are feeling maybe like their voice is not going to be heard no matter what they do. So they might not seem engaged in the process. I'm curious if you can speak a little to that.
Yeah. I mean, one of the things that I try to do in my role, right? I've sort of earned the privilege of being able to have a certain amount of expertise in transition planning. And I pay a lot of attention to what we know from research in the field of transition planning. And I really try to remind anybody who's involved, parent, teacher, whoever, that what we know to be most effective for students is if we allow them to be self-determined, right? If we help them to build the skills so that they can set goals for themselves, can make choices, can break a goal down into smaller steps and then help to execute that goal, right? Can utilize resources in their environment. So it's interesting because people may be concerned about a student having unrealistic goals for themselves. But I also think students should get the dignity of having unrealistic goals for themselves. I mean, when we start any school year, you always see pictures on social media where it's like, what are you going to be when you grow up, right? And you get to put whatever you want on that sign. And yes, I know there's a difference between a 21-year-old who's putting something on a sign that maybe other people would have put on the sign when they were 7 or 8, but we just don't, like, none of us really knows what another individual is capable of when we're talking about individuals who are in the first quarter of their lives, right? Um, so you don't know for sure that a goal is unrealistic until you start to try certain things. I mean, I know there are situations when we know that it's a little unrealistic, but instead of taking the attitude of like, yes, you can do this or no, you can't, we really always want to start with the attitude of like, what would it take to accomplish that goal, right? And based on what it would take to accomplish that goal, what are the starting steps? the reality is that when we take, say, a career goal of I want to be an astronaut, or I want to be president of the United States, or I want to be a starting, basketball player on an NBA team, like the starting steps, I like the starting steps are often the same, or there are some common starting steps for any of those things. There are some common starting steps that would be useful for any, substitute any other job on the top of that chain. And then there are some niche and very specific skills that go into that. And so, if you want to be a basketball player on an NBA team, are you out shooting 1,000 baskets a day? Like,
Right.
well, let's try that, right? Sort of put some of the goals in place or the short-term steps in place that might help that individual to be able to progress towards what they want, right? Respect their voice. I think it's really important that when young people, or I mean, when anybody is self-advocating for themselves, that they feel heard, right? There's nothing sadder than what you described, which is a teenager or a young adult who's determined that their voice doesn't really matter in the process. If we're not involving an individual, if we're not being responsive to their voice in the process, then we are disempowering our kids and we are disempowering students. And like that's the worst possible outcome, right? And we know that that's an unsuccessful way for a student to transition to adulthood, is feeling like their voice doesn't matter, their choice doesn't matter. So really I would just encourage that what we know from research is that teaching students self-advocacy skills and allowing students to advocate for themselves and being responsive, and students believing that their voice and their choice makes a difference, like that is more successful in the long term than a student who's in eighth grade having a really realistic employment goal for themselves, right? So we
Absolutely.
want to support the self-advocacy. We want to put the steps in place, and the rest will come along with that process.
It reminds me of the joke, someone asked, how do you get to Carnegie Hall? And the answer is practice, practice, practice.
Yeah.
Um, so absolutely, I think that's such a wonderful framing. And just for our last few minutes together, I'm wondering if there's any, as you're talking about, helping kids to understand and build those self-advocacy skills, or really young adults. Are there any strategies you can share for supporting teens, young adults, anyone in that transition planning time to identify and communicate what supports work for them?
Yeah, so for individuals themselves, I mean, I think I'm a big fan of self-assessments. I know that and we have a lot of like internet-based, all kinds of different self-assessments, and now we have AI, which,
Yeah,
is potentially not always individualized and not always accurate, but it's another way of exploring different things. But I think if you're working to become a better self advocate, I mean, one community resource that exists in every state across the country is something called an independent living center.
mm,
I mean, certainly Autism Asperger Network is a great, that's actually not your name anymore, and I apologize.
no worries. We are now,
But
for anyone wondering, we are now the Association for Autism and Neurodiversity.
yeah. And so A&E is a wonderful resource in terms of providing community and resources, right, for becoming a better self-advocate. Support groups are wonderful, talking with other individuals. But I think it's also figuring out the best way for your voice to be heard, the best way that you can share your voice with other people. Sometimes that's spoken word, but sometimes that's written word. Sometimes that's getting somebody else to speak, like speak up when your voice just isn't being heard. So it's really, I think just the act of trying to self-advocate is a win in some ways. And as I said, like it's really disheartening when it's not heard or it doesn't succeed the first time. But the more that you advocate for yourself, the more that you try speaking up, the more successful you will be over time, the more it becomes a skill and it becomes a muscle, right? It's something you practice. And I think it's also, like finding the people who will listen to you, finding the people who will be in your corner. Um, yes, we all want to be great self-advocates, and then like we all need like other people in our networks who will advocate for us too, or who will amplify our voice. So there's so many different things that young people can do to, like build up the skill, practice the skill, be more heard. And it's just knowing some of those resources and trying different things to learn more about yourself, learn what's important for you, and then like bring that message forward.
I love that. And I love that you highlighted building community, because I think that when folks, what we hear a lot from folks in our support groups is that being in community together and listening to other folks who are advocating for themselves, or listening to, hey, this worked for me. Okay, well, maybe I can ask for that and that tool will be helpful for me. Um, is like a wonderful way to build self-advocacy skills, I think.
Yeah.
Um, so I want to thank you so much for being here with us today. And I want to let folks know that the link below will go to registration for our symposium on self-advocacy for folks looking to learn more. And then Kelley, we will also link your website below so that folks can find you and see what you're up to and hopefully work with you. Do you work only with folks in the state of Massachusetts, or do you work with folks anywhere?
No, I work nationally and internationally with individuals, and it always just depends sort of what kind of support they're needing.
Yeah.
And I love to, I actually think it's nice to work in a lot of different towns, communities, states, other things. I think you learn a lot and you can share different tools with different people that way.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for being here, and we'll hopefully see you around some more. Thanks
Thank you
everyone
so
for
much, Maggie.
watching.